Okay, as you've noticed, we've mixed up the two panels, which is a nice icon on the fact that we want to make connections. It's actually random, anyway. So, if people want to ask questions to individual speakers about their particular talks, fine. But it'd be even better if you can start drawing out connections between the two pairs of presentations. So, I'll open it up to the...
Can we also draw connections?
Yes. Oh, very well. So.
Okay, I'm just going to continue a rant I've just been having here with Lisa, because I've been involved in a project quite similar to Pelle's over the last 2 years. And I was just saying that we come to the end of this kind of social innovation, sort of urban ethnography project in a very deprived neighbourhood of Leeds. And I don't know where to go next with it, really, in a sense, because we've come up with this data, and there's this kind of possibility for creativity around this data. But actually, you're dealing with, for example, an area of such a vacuum in terms of what is there to deal with and what can be developed, in such a vacuum in terms of local authority policy and lack of imagination, I suppose. It's like, as a designer, where do you go next? And I just wondered if that question of the social innovation model, I suppose, in the Manzini thing is like you find something where something which is happening and you design tools to develop it, and sort of, what if nothing's happening? Where do you go?
Well, I think first of all, you're there because of the hope that something will happen, so, for instance, in our lab, there's been collaboration with in 30 different experiments. Some of them with some 300 people. Some of this has not gone any further than the big experiment that you did, so I think what we are doing, and this might be really contested terrain, is that so for instance with Harris Women Association, working very strongly with building a business model for it, and trying to find ways to raise capital, or maybe it's from the city, to make this into something that is sustainable. So very much going into the arena of democratic innovation, but not doing so innocently, knowing that this is tough, that there are very diverse interests in this arena. But I think that's so, going from having designed stuff in collaboration between people to see, are there steps where these solutions can be sustainable, and does that mean that you actually start to play on the arena of new forms of financing, new forms of making business models, new so I don't know if a lot of it will not work, and I think that's really interesting here is, as we've seen many interesting UK examples of in social innovation, that one strategy could be to actually show that this is in economic terms beneficial, like some of the stuff you've done on unemployment, etc. Now, I don't know if that's a good strategy, but you can come up with data that says that actually as we had in your example with the girls, that this pays off to engage people who are unemployed, to find ways to work rather than just pay. And if that's a good strategy or not, I don't know. But I think a next step must be in some way to go tap into that territory where where resources can be made available for something that is more long term.
I wanted to connect to what Alex was talking about, the accountability of the designer. It's about also reframing and how that accountability is measured, and also thinking about temporality as well, because I mean, the problem with, for example, our project is that it's a very, very slow-moving thing. And yes, there are potentialities there, but they're going to take an awful long time to develop and nurture and so on. And it's a kind of different sort of temporal schema to what Leeds City Council does.
Yeah.
One sort of issue that seems to me to draw both the mission work and Pelle is...
You speak up a bit.
Sorry. One issue that seems to draw the two talks together is what could probably be called the problem of the designer and the poor.
Sorry,
The designer and the poor. There's this very nice book of Jacques Rancière called Philosopher and the Poor. And Rancière is trying to show that philosophy needs the poor to think. And poor in many ways. And it seems to me that in both of your talks, it's designers need the poor to design. And specifically in participatory design, you need the poor to produce participation. I wonder what that means. And specifically, I wonder whether participatory design could learn something from science studies, because it seems to me that science studies in a certain way has, well, not overcome, but found many different ways of, say, not needing the poor to think, but rather needing the rich to think, the non-poor.
Sure, I'll jump on it. So, thank you, and I see some of those connections, but maybe I put it a slightly different way. So I thought there was tremendous connections in these talks, and maybe jumping like on Michael's question from the final prompt from Alex about accountability. Again, first I'm going to come out as I'm a science-based person who's also a historian rather than an anthropologist. So I think that also brings a certain set of questions to the table. And accountability is that interesting term, right? It's both about counting, quantification, indexes, measure, and it's about ethics, responsibility, right? So it vacillates in these interesting ways. And these questions remind me of questions that happen in critical development studies. So, the EU Living Labs, et cetera, have genealogical relationships to this kind of longer history of development, of population labs, of communication, community studies that began in the 60s as a kind of post-colonial governmentality, post-colonial social science. And here, it reminds me of Chatterjee's book, The Politics of the Governed. And one of the things, I think one of the most useful things for me in that book is he points out that about the ways in people as participants are required to form themselves into ethicized communities in order to be seen as agents in these collaborations. And that certainly seems to be happening in your case, in which it's not just any old community that has to be named, but it has to be ethicized in a way in which that can be dominantly read as ethics. Afghan Women's Association, Women in Orphans. And so the question of ethics, I think, haunts all this. Like, that we're living in a moment where ethics themselves are the object of design. Ethics exists for us in the form of index measures and protocols, which further makes me then also want to kind of put into play here process as another thing we hold dear, but which is, kind of agonistic, to use your word. So on the one hand, in science studies and design, we're meeting and in history too, in anthropology, we have this meeting point where what brings us together is that we no longer take the a priori thingness of the thing, but what we're interested in is exposing and acting at the level of the relations, the assemblies, the processes which constitute the thing. Well, we can look at that genealogically. We could look at, Marx, Heidegger, all sorts of people, not just Latour, who, that's a dominant, in fact, I would claim, it is the dominant way of thinking critically in our moment, that we want to step back from it and say, well, we're kind of both shaped and bound from a kind of a ethical authority to elevate relations. And so this is another, point to kind of be playing with, and the way maybe I'll bring that home is by thinking about patent law. We live in a moment of patent law in which what has become elevated is the patenting of process, not things. And that is how we commodify life. So, just to kind of do that again, so this question of like ethics and accountability in all this is again, we're in that space where the things we just hold most dear and need are also really non-innocent, and it seems like all of us are struggling in that space.
I want to come back to the political dimension of that, and just to frame your question, this whole imperative in the last 10 years in the UK in particular for design of the multicultural city. And this absolute demand that planners and architects should be able to find a solution. And the solution is precisely one of the convergence of sameness. So we have to design for communities and for harmony. And as a result, I think we start out with the wrong kind of data and the wrong kind of incredibly banal and dull questions. So maybe we should be designing cities that are less efficient and less harmonious, with a real respect of how they actually work, and understanding the contestations and the coming together as equally important dimensions. So I think it makes design a far more political process, because you actually have to choose what question you want to ask, what value system you subscribe to or don't.
Yeah, and what that does is it problematizes two things. It's not just the goals that you're actually trying to achieve, right? You're saying, is that something that we really ought to be doing? But it's also saying, what is the relevant data? What should we be looking for? And that, I think, is a huge opportunity for designers, and why we're turning to designers increasingly to do things like redesign government agencies and services and things, is because, those of us, sociology, we'll throw that in the room too, those of us in the social sciences who've been involved in this process for a long time have come to, I think, reify our data and reify what those questions are that should be asked and what data is relevant in any process. And design coming into that relatively recently hasn't been doing that yet, at least not when it's given the option. Right? If somebody hands you a pile of data and says, now go envision something wonderful with this data that we've just given you, that's a different thing. But if you're actually allowed to get it yourself, to live with the groups that you're being asked to design for, and to see organically what emerges the way the ethnographers do, then it opens up all kinds of new possibilities, because you throw both of those questions up into the air. What is the outcome that we should be looking for? And what's the data that would be relevant for us to get in order to get where we want to be?
Just not to respond to that partly, to say that actually the data itself can be used in many different ways. They're different, but they're different sort of levels of truth, of being true to your data. That depends on what context is being mobilized.
So now I'm just going to mention a project that I think is relevant to what we've just heard, which is Architecture and Justice by Dorian Kurgan from Columbia. I don't know how many people are aware of this project. This is about asking completely different questions about the justice system in America, and I encourage everybody to look at it, everybody who's interested in this particular topic of conversation, where they've actually asked, instead of looking at where crimes have been committed, they actually looked at the criminals' postal addresses and then actually identified that there were what they call $1 million blocks, which were effectively, they had an external system of prisons that supported these inner city blocks. And of course the question that brings is that they're actually architects, Pelle and Kerridge. And they actually looked at what happens when that sort of amount of money is being spent on a prison system as opposed to being. I mean, it shows direct correlation between urban planning and particular systems that are in place with the justice system in America. But I would encourage to read that. It's available online.
It was a response to the idea of the rarefication of data and how design coming in quite late to those policy-making processes brings something new to it. I'd like to try and work out why that is, and I think the main questions is what led to the rarefication of the data within something like sociology, if that's the posture. But also, why do designers look? Why do we look? Do we look at things differently in that way? I think partly it's because we're sloppy and disorganised and not very rigorous, which I will hold dear and fight for. But I think part of that is that we don't see it as data. So there's something around the language of the distancing of both being critical and the analysis of data, where if you're kind of in it, it becomes something else. But I think it links something that we've been talking about, but I can't quite articulate it as well.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to save all my comments for later, but it's just a local response to your comment, because I don't actually use the word data myself. I don't identify with that word as other than a critical object. I talk about materials, and just to say that I think there could be an important and interesting discussion we could have about notions of rigor and different ways in which we might think about and enact what I do think about as empirical research, not empiricist, but empirical research, and what it means to do that rigorously if you don't believe in that what you're doing is creating data.
Yeah, I think you can apply that to design and to process, rather to thinking. I think that, like Lucy is saying, that then you're not maybe so engaged in data, but in the materials, in the people that's in the situation, in the activities. And I think from a design point of view, at least as I view it, it's data is not there. It's being continuously produced by the actions that you're involved in. And I do not agree with you when you say that. If you look at, for instance, Hairless Women Association, if we take this this example, it's true that you can certainly describe them as an ethnically homogeneous group, but the thinking that's going on is not only Hairless Women Association. It's a very aggressive care company. It is the city of Malmö with some specific interest. There is a culture production company which could be maybe more aligned, etc. But the whole idea, as I understand it, is that the heterogeneity comes exactly in the thinking, and that's the point. If we could expect harmony and homogeneity, then we would not need to do this. The whole idea is to find ways to align those different interests in a way which could still make things develop. And the question of accountability, and there have been raised really many good reflections on it. So the simple strategy that is in this case has been to, which is I guess a heritage from an old participatory design, to in some way to work bottom up, start to engage with those marginalized. You can say that is also that could also be problematic, but that's the rationale behind such a strategy. But at the same time, draw in all kind of resources and real powerful players that comes into it. Yeah. So would not agree that these are homogeneous assemblies. On the contrary.
Oh, that's precisely what I was saying.
Yeah.
Michelle.
I just to kind of further a little more the conversation about data. Kind of set of research that I've done is on the longest running demographic surveillance site in the world in Uppsala, Bangladesh, which is like a kind of EU living lab of an area that's been going since 1960. It began as a Cold War military project, and then it became is today a really celebrated international center for development research, really public health research, with the first awardee of a Gates Award, for example. It's called the International Center of Diarrhea Disease Research. And it has produced, over its histories, a kind of really complex sets of data built on data, but not just the data, it's the infrastructure to produce the data. And once you have an infrastructure to produce data, even when it begins as a kind of really kind of politically interesting and subversive project, that infrastructure can then be appropriated to take on new lives. And so to also think about data as the infrastructure that is producing the data, not just the data. And when you look at these then kind of histories of these infrastructures of data being reanimated to different purposes, having lives, circulating, the question of data becomes absolutely not reified. And in the end, with this particular, research, my kind of major conclusion, I would say, is that what has happened after 50 years of research into cholera and diarrhea in this area that has endemic diarrhea, which is a disease of a way of dying and dispossession, that today you still have diarrhea as a way of dying and dispossession, but what you have is an amazing infrastructure of social science and public health and satellite research that tells us, there's a lot of people dying of diarrhea. So, and in fact, the main, the new recent study in the, forgetting PNAS, what's that stand for? It's the National Academy of Science journal, so it's a really eminent journal, it's hard to publish it. Is, you take an old sari and you fold it 8 times and you pass your water through it, and that's like wonderful. That's, the result of this, probably $1 billion spent on a surveillance infrastructure, people are already filtering water with their saris. So, I guess what I'm saying is that this question of even data and infrastructure has all sorts of interesting histories that we could pull into the conversation too, which make us kind of less alone, I think, in some of these questions.
I know there are other questions, but it's lunchtime.